Good day. In this video, I'm going to be focusing, to the extent that I can, on the latest diplomatic moves by the Chinese government, which are becoming increasingly concerted and increasingly powerful, and I would suggest show renewed Chinese self-confidence and also a renewed push by China to engage in the world now that its lockdown policies in China itself have been disposed of, and given that there is growing signs that the Chinese economy itself is starting to experience an economic surge. But before I do that, I'm going to discuss the situation in Ukraine and the various Chinese moves that flow from that. As we'll see, the Chinese are not just talking about Ukraine, but Ukraine, to a great extent, still remains the epicenter of the geopolitical battle. It still remains the event that is framing diplomatic and political activity around the world, and which still has a disproportionate effect on the situation in the world economy. So let's first of all discuss what's actually going on the Ukrainian battlefields. And we've had quite a lot of information pouring out from the main battlefield, which is Bakhmut. This, as I've said many times, has been, as far as the Russians at least are concerned, the main battleground, at least since August. There was a lot of fighting in Kherson. There was a difficult, for the Russians, experience in Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians mounted a successful counteroffensive in September. But the Russian military effort since August has been, to a degree which I think is not fully understood, very much focused on Bakhmut. And this is also true of the Ukrainian forces as well. Now, helpfully, just the other day, a Russian channel again provided a list of the Ukrainian military formations that are engaged in the fighting in and around Bakhmut. And again, I counted around 30. Some of them nominally brigades, in fact, probably all of them technically at brigade level. I would say that I very, very much doubt that most of these units are anywhere close up to strength by now. But Bakhmut continues to be the focus of an enormous amount of Ukrainian military power. It's where a large part of the Ukrainian army is focused, and I don't think it is difficult to understand why. We've discussed this many times in various videos. It stands at the center, the hub of the transport network in central and northern Donbass. It's also controls the high ground that looks down over places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk further west, which would be the last line of defense that Ukraine has before it's basically driven out of Donbass entirely. And of course, last but not least, and this is, I suspect, the key to the whole issue, if Bakhmut falls, if the Russians are able to place their artillery and strike forces on the surrounding hills, if they're able to launch attacks on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which are in low-lying country, if they're able to capture those two towns and other places like Konstantinovka and Siversk, which is highly likely in the event that Bakhmut were to fall, well, it then becomes perhaps not an open ground all the way to the Dnieper River, but certainly the obstacles before the Russians, were they to decide to launch an advance towards the Dnieper, would greatly diminish. And just to say again, if the Russians get to the center of the Dnieper, in the central regions of Ukraine, then in my opinion, looking at the map of Ukraine, understanding the economic and human geography of Ukraine, with many of the most important cities and industrial areas outside the east of Ukraine strung along the Dnieper River, well, at that point, it seems to me that Ukraine is facing perhaps not an existential crisis, but an extremely severe one. And at that point, its situation would become extremely grave indeed. So it's understandable that Ukraine has been so determined to hold on to Bakhmut for as long as it can, and it's understandable why the Russians have committed great resources to capturing Bakhmut and have been going about it in such a single-minded way ever since August, not letting themselves get distracted by Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, which the Russians clearly consider secondary theatres in this war. Anyway, that's just an overview, just a restatement of the importance of Bakhmut. By the way, I should quickly add, I'm not suggesting that if Bakhmut falls, the Battle of Donbass immediately ends. There will be many weeks, perhaps months, of very hard fighting going on beyond that. But it would mark a very significant milestone towards the end of that larger battle, the Battle of Donbass, which I suspect, by the way, when this war is concluded, will be seen as the decisive battle of the war in Ukraine. Anyway, let's now focus on what's actually going on in Bakhmut. Now, first of all, it looks as if the argument between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the nominal or titular head of the Wagner private military company, and the Russian Ministry of Defense has been resolved. Prigozhin has issued more statements today saying that his problems with ammunition have been resolved, that there's trainloads of ammunition heading in his direction, and that before long the Wagner forces will obtain all the ammunition that they need. Prigozhin has also made claims that the important village of Berkhova will quickly fall to the Wagner assault troops. He's claimed that it's probably now only a matter of days before it does. That's unusual for him. He's usually slow to make such announcements, but this time, perhaps because of the arguments he's had with the Russian Ministry of Defense, he's come out and said more quickly that Berkhova is about to be captured. And in fact, there are reports that the Russians control between half and 2/3 of this village. It depends which report you give the greater credence to. But anyway, it does seem as if the Russians are very close to capturing this village. And I noticed that the British Ministry of Defense says that the Russians are engaging in a creeping encirclement of Bakhmut, that they're still managing, that the Ukrainians are still managing to keep open some of their supply lines. But it's clear that even the British Ministry of Defense accepts that an encirclement of Bakhmut, a creeping encirclement of Bakhmut, as it likes to call it, is underway. And as I've said, there's also intense fighting within the town itself. The Russians are close to the center, or perhaps even at the center of the town. They're closing in on a particular factory complex, which they say the Ukrainians have turned into a fortified area. They're closing in on the area where the monument to the MiG-17 is located, which is very much in the west of the town. And so the pressure in Bakhmut is both within the town itself and with these two pincers from the north and the south, which are, as the British say, encircling it in a sort of creeping way. And I have to say, it does look increasingly as if that encirclement is happening. And there are now Russian reports which effectively confirm that after Berkhova and after some other villages in and around Berkhova have been captured, there will be a renewed push south towards Chasov Yar, where the other pincer that the Russians have been pushing, which is from the southeast, where that is also close to being positioned. So this seems to be the Russian strategy. And note that the Russians appear to be trying to encircle a larger area than just Bakhmut itself. It's clear, as I've said already, that their intention is not just to capture Bakhmut and to encircle the Ukrainian troops who are defending Bakhmut itself. They are aiming to encircle at least some of this larger group of Ukrainian forces that are located close to Bakhmut. And I also read a report today that General Syrsky, who is the ground forces commander of the Ukrainian army, by the way, and in parenthesis, I think I've mentioned this before, General Syrsky was born in Russia during the time of the Soviet Union, in the town of Vladimir, apparently, and trained at the Moscow Command School, and is by most accounts an ethnic Russian. Just mentioning that, he's the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, but he's got a Russian background. But anyway, it seems that General Syrsky, who clearly conceives of himself as a professional officer loyal to the army to which he belongs, which is the Ukrainian army, he apparently is continuing, as is General Zaluzhny, as is President Zelensky, to pour reinforcements, to try to hold Bakhmut, to try to stop these two pincers from closing. And I'm going to suggest, and I've suggested before, that this actually plays into the Russian strategy, which is to try to grind the Ukrainians down, to inflict upon the Ukrainians as many losses as possible. Now, with the situation in Bakhmut becoming increasingly critical for Ukraine, the Ukrainians and their British sponsors, Britain, by the way, is the country that seems to be playing the major role in talking up Ukrainian successes and presenting the Ukrainian spin to the war. Anyway, the British Ministry of Defence, in its latest intelligence update, is talking about Ukrainian successes in Vuhledar. And there have actually been some reports that the Ukrainians have indeed managed to push the Russian forces back a little from Vuhledar. And the British Ministry of Defence claims that the Russian general who is in command in this area, General Muradov, is supposedly under pressure. How they know that, goodness knows, but under political pressure to turn and retrieve the situation in Vuhledar. And, well, but that he probably lacks the number of troops necessary to carry out a breakthrough there. This is, by the way, what the British always say. They always say that the Russians lack the forces to achieve a breakthrough, largely ignoring the fact that there are between 300,000 or 500,000 or whatever hundreds of thousands of Russian troops supposedly in the area, including the 190 brigades that the Ukrainians, battalions rather, that the Ukrainians claim are located in and around Donetsk city. Now, as I said, this has been a difficult battle in Vuhledar. It's gone backwards and forwards. The Russians clearly have been struggling to storm Vuhledar. There are other reports, and I have to say this in parenthesis, that Ukrainian counterattacks in and around Vuhledar have been unsuccessful. But of course, I'm not in the location, so I can't say what is true. I'm going to go along with the claim, the Ukrainian and British claim, that they did push the Russians back in some places around Vuhledar, though it's clear that the Russians are still very close to the town, or perhaps actually inside parts of the town. But anyway, it does also seem that the Russians are reinforcing their forces around Vuhledar. And as I said previously, I am sure that Vuhledar is an actual objective which the Russians do intend to capture. Now, I would quickly add that in any war, in any battle of this kind, some degree of ebb and flow is inevitable. And it is also, I'm sorry to say, the case that Ukraine has made claims about successful counterattacks in the past, in particular battles like this, which have not always turned out to be true. I remember, for example, way back during the fighting in Severodonetsk, that the Ukrainians and the British Ministry of Defense and the British media were talking euphorically about a successful Ukrainian counterattack in Severodonetsk, which perhaps never happened, and in the event, the town actually fell to the Russians a few days later. So I'm not saying that this particular attack in Vuhledar is like that. It's just that I don't personally think that it has any great significance. What I will also say is that it's clear that the Russians have experienced significant losses in Vuhledar, but again, in and around Vuhledar, they have a massive advantage in artillery, and it's clear again that any Ukrainian counterattacks are having to take place in the face of very severe Russian artillery barrages. And that must mean that the Ukrainians are suffering significant losses. It's almost a given that they are suffering very significant losses in the event of their carrying out of these sort of counterattacks. And again, that might not be actually a particularly good idea. I'm going to come back to the concept of mobile defense, which is what the Western powers are now supposedly advising the Ukrainians to transition to shortly. But suffice to say that if the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks into areas under the fire control of the Russian guns, then they're not engaging in mobile defense. They are, on the contrary, playing again into the Russian strategy of attrition, which has been the Russian strategy in this war ever since the Battle of Donbass began in earnest back in April. So that's what I'm going to say about Vuhledar. There's lots of reports now coming out of Russian advances in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area and around Kupiansk. And there's reports that the Ukrainians are rushing reinforcements to Kupiansk, that they're trying to create defenses there, all in a very short time frame. Kupiansk, by the way, might be difficult to defend. This is my own inexpert opinion, but it's divided into two parts. There's one which is on the west bank of the Oskol River, and the other which is on the east bank of the Oskol River. And I would have thought that it would be relatively straightforward for the Russians to destroy the rather small bridge. Kupiansk is not a huge place. The rather small bridge that links the two halves of this river. It would certainly come within range of Russian artillery, probably is under range of Russian artillery already. And yes, the Ukrainians can create pontoon bridges. And yes, the Oskol River is not a particularly big or deep or wide river, so they can no doubt in some places wade across and perhaps ford it in some places, and some Ukrainian vehicles, those of Soviet manufacture, are amphibious. So yes, they could probably continue to keep their forces supplied in Kupiansk, but it might not be, I think, an entirely straightforward thing to do. And I personally would not be surprised if even the Ukrainians decide that it's impossible to hold on to Kupiansk, the east bank, the part of Kupiansk which is on the east bank of the Oskol River, and that it might make more sense for them and might cause them fewer losses to pull back across the Oskol River and to try to defend the western part of Kupiansk, where the Oskol River would provide some protection. But of course, it's not just in Kupiansk, which I think perhaps is a genuine target for the Russians. Perhaps the Russians really do intend to try and recapture Kupiansk. But it's not just there that the fighting is going on in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, and there are now lots of reports that the Russians have managed to push forward quite far in Kremenaya, and they are apparently gaining kilometers of territory in this region, and that does beg questions about what the Russian objective is. And a Russian war reporter from the area, who goes by the interesting name of Starsky Eddy, just mentioning that, presume it's not his actual name. Many Russian war reporters come up with colorful names like this. Anyway, he says that overall, the Russian position, the Russian posture in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area remains defensive, that the Russians are not launching a big offensive in this area. They are aware that the Ukrainians might at some point decide to do so. So at the moment, when the Ukrainians are focusing such forces as they have on trying to hold back the Russian advance in Bakhmut, and when the Ukrainians are sending troops to try to regain ground in Vuhledar, the Russians are taking advantage of that and of the weakening of Ukrainian forces in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area to capture hills and other locations and basically improve their defense lines. Now, that could very well be true. How am I going to say one way or the other? I'm not on the spot. I'm not able to interview and discuss things with the local commanders. They would presumably anyway refuse to tell me what their plans were. So I don't know what is the truth. But I will say this, Starsky Eddy has, on balance, been a pretty good reporter. Mostly what he says does turn out to be true. On balance, I think he's probably right about what he's saying. Anyway, there's also lots of reports that the Russians are preparing some further sort of missile strikes to time with the anniversary of the start of the current phase of the conflict on the 24th of February. No way of knowing whether that is the case or not. What I would say is that in the meantime, the regular Russian missile strikes continue. I've seen pictures of Ukrainian industrial facilities which have been badly damaged by, or even destroyed by, Russian cruise missile strikes. There was one which showed a burnt-out factory, and you could see the tail part of the KH-101 cruise missile, Russian cruise missile, that had struck this facility, perhaps one of several, who knows? But anyway, there were pictures of it, and it does seem as if the situation, the missile strikes, continue on a fairly regular basis. And on that topic, I'm also reading more reports that the Ukrainian air defense system has now effectively, well, perhaps not entirely closed down, but it's not operating at anything like the level of intensity that it was earlier in the war, and that the Ukrainian Air Force has, to all intents and purposes, disappeared from the skies. Now, these are reports which, again, let me stress, I'm not able to confirm, but there we are. I mean, they do exist, they are circulating, they are appearing in all sorts of places. Perhaps they're true. Before I now turn to Chinese matters, let me just also say that I mentioned in my program yesterday that I'd had a very, very helpful email from a former NATO intelligence officer, very experienced intelligence officer, who was very skeptical about the whole idea of Ukraine transitioning to a mobile defense system. And he made the point that NATO armies may talk about mobile defense, but they don't really train for it. And he did send a follow-up email, which I think is an important one, in which he explained that yes, at the theoretical level, NATO armies do accept the concept of mobile defense. It is very much something that, at the staff level they talk about and they think about quite a lot. But at the actual operational level, the level of training troops, it doesn't happen to any very great degree. Training levels for NATO armies have been cut back significantly since the end of the Cold War. When training does take place, which is at regular but extended intervals, the training levels are on a relatively small scale, consistent with the small size of the forces involved, and that it tends to be very, very carefully stage managed and controlled, at least on the part of European armies. And he also makes the further point that mobile defense, indeed mobile operations in general, require very high levels of training on the part of the combat troops and especially the officers. And this doesn't take place to anything like the necessary degree within NATO armies anymore, at least not within European NATO armies. He's a little bit more careful in making this claim about the US military, which of course operates on a much bigger scale. And he makes the point that the Germans, who before and during the Second World War were the people who perhaps perfected and honed mobile combined arms operations, not only trained intensively for them, but had a policy where officers, during training and perhaps even initially in combat, if they made mistakes, this was accepted and tolerated, provided the officers learnt from those mistakes, so that it was a gradually accumulative thing, because it was understood that if people were punished for mistakes in carrying out these very difficult types of operation, well, that would, in effect, freeze up the whole training process and make it impossible to train units to the requisite standard. And this intelligence officer says that this isn't the case in NATO armies, to his knowledge, that in training situations, presumably even more so in actual combat situations, officers who make mistakes get severely reprimanded and punished, and that their career prospects are severely damaged. Now, on the last point, I can certainly confirm that is the case with the British Army. This is from something that I've encountered. I've, over the course of my life, met quite a few embittered and distressed former British Army officers who've been retired with the rank of captain, the British Army having very much, an up or out sort of promotion system. I believe the US Army has the same. And it did strike me that many of these people were very unhappy and very embittered. But it also struck me that given the high cost of failure or of error, that must affect initiative on the parts of officers in training, junior officers in training. They would be very afraid of making mistakes. And I've read reports, this I can't confirm because I don't know the American military. I've not had that much experience of American military officers. But I read reports that the same is true in the US military. And according to this NATO intelligence officer, that is exactly the opposite of the kind of training philosophy, training of officers philosophy, which you need if you're really going to put together forces that are going to be skilled in conducting combined arms operations. Well, I thought it was an interesting email. Again, it's something that's a little outside my own province. I know lots of people with military backgrounds follow these programs. If you want to comment about this on the threads, please do, and I will take great attention in considering anything that you say. One observation I'm actually going to make, which is that I doubt that there's been very much training about how to conduct defensives, the defensive war, in any NATO military for at least the last 30 years since the Cold War ended. Because realistically, in what war that NATO has fought or that Western armies have fought since the end of the Soviet Union, would NATO or any Western army have been anticipating that they would find themselves on any kind of defensive in what might be considered a conventional high-intensity war? I mean, realistically, that doesn't happen any longer. I mean, they weren't presumably expecting to find themselves on the defensive in any significant way against an army like, say, Saddam Hussein's. So I doubt that there's been a great deal of emphasis or priority given to defensive war on the part of NATO militaries for quite a long time now. Of course, during the Cold War, it was different. And it may be that there are some memories of some of the training and some of the concepts that were involved at that time still embedded in the institutional memories of some of these militaries. But I doubt that there are many officers today, many serving officers, at least below the very high command level, who remember or have experienced much of that. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Let's now turn to the Chinese. China, as I said, is now making big moves. And to reiterate again, I think that this reflects Chinese self-confidence. The Chinese economy has finally been opened up. They've put the long years of lockdowns behind them. There is now growing evidence of an industrial surge underway in China. Imports of oil are being stepped up, something which, by the way, I fully expect is going to have an impact on global energy prices before very long. But as I said, the Chinese domestic economy seems to be moving up a few gears. I know this isn't always the view among some people in the United States, but the figures I'm seeing seem to confirm that. And as I said, I'm getting the sense that with the period of the lockdowns behind them, a certain spring, a certain bounce has now returned to the Chinese. And of course, their top diplomats, their people are able to travel around the world again, meet other leaders, engage with them, and start to formulate their particular ideas. And we've seen that Wang Yi, China's long-standing and extremely able foreign minister, has now been promoted to the Politburo and is now in charge, as far as I can see. He's the kind of overall foreign policy supremo in China. He's now been traveling around the world. He attended the Munich Security Conference. He's been on a tour of Europe, and he's just visited Moscow. And he's had meetings there with all the top Russian officials, all the main officials who engage in foreign policy matters. So he's spoken to Patrushev, Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, the secretary of Russia's very powerful Security Council, the person who overall coordinates Russian intelligence gathering and provides reports on this to Putin himself. He's also had a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, and he's also had a meeting with Putin himself. Now, Putin has been an extraordinarily busy man over the last couple of days. He's given his State of the Nation address to the Russian Federal Assembly. Yesterday, he also attended a rally at Luzhniki Stadium. This is the former Olympic Stadium in Moscow. Thousands of people there. This is all done in commemoration of what the Russians call Defense of the Fatherland, Motherland Day. This is the day, in other words, that the Russians commemorate and remember their armed forces. During the Soviet era, it used to be Red Army Day, once upon a time. But anyway, that's today it's Defenders of the Motherland today. And as I said, Putin attended this big festival at Luzhniki, but he nonetheless met with Wang Yi. And the Russians have provided a readout. We will no doubt be getting a readout from the Chinese eventually, but it hasn't yet appeared. And it doesn't actually tell us a very great deal. It's a sort of very bland readout, but nonetheless, we have had some of the opening comments that the two officials made to each other, and we have Putin saying, for example, I would like to note that Russian-Chinese relations are progressing as we planned in previous years. They're progressing and growing steadily, and we are reaching new milestones. And it is our ambition to reach the level of $200 billion in trade in 2024. Last year, we reached $185 billion. There is every reason to believe that we will achieve our goals in terms of trade, perhaps even earlier than planned, because bilateral trade is growing. And then he says, this is Putin, international relations are complicated at present, and the situation hardly improved after the collapse of the bipolar system. That means, he means here, the system of the US, United States, and the Soviet Union being countering each other. He says that collapsed, and he goes on to say, on the contrary, tensions spiraled. In this regard, Russian-Chinese cooperation in the international arena, as we have repeatedly stressed, is very important for stabilizing the international situation. And Wang Yi agreed, and he says at considerable, he discusses considerable length the importance of Russian-Chinese relations. He says, amid an extremely important, this is from Wang Yi now, amid an extremely important, complex and volatile international situation, China-Russia relations have withstood the pressure exerted by the international community. It's an interesting choice of words. I have in the past said that when Western officials refer to the international community, they mean the United States and its friends. And we see that Wang Yi appears to be using those words in that sense, according to this Russian readout. And anyway, he then goes on to say, and that they're developing, Chinese-Russian relations are developing quite sustainably, although the crisis constantly makes itself felt. Crises offer opportunities, and opportunities may turn into crisis, which we know from history, very Chinese. So we need to redouble our efforts to respond to the crisis and the opportunities and to deepen our cooperation. We are also here to emphasize that our relations are never directed against third countries and, of course, are not subject to pressure from third parties, since we have a very strong economic, political, and cultural foundation. We have gained quite an extensive experience precisely because we are supportive of multipolarity and democratization of international relations, which is fully in line with the spirit of the times and history and meets the interests of most countries as well. In conjunction with the Russian side, we are looking forward to maintaining political determination, deepening political mutual trust and strategic cooperation, comprehensively expanding practical cooperation in order to play a major constructive role in ensuring the interests of our countries and promoting progress around the world. Now, there's one thing very unusual and rather curious about this particular Russian readout, which is that it contains a mistake. And that mistake is the following. It quotes Wang Yi as saying to Putin, "You said that the Russian side invited Mr. Wang Yi to visit Russia as soon as possible. So I visited Russia as scheduled in order to comprehensively implement the agreements of our leaders so as to achieve great results in our cooperation across various fields." I think this is a slightly clumsy translation. I think probably what Wang Yi was referring to is the fact that Xi Jinping is due to visit Russia very soon. That's also been confirmed. He's apparently due in March. And I think someone somewhere made a rather clunky translation here of Wang Yi's words. But anyway, let's put that aside. It's just an unusual case of perhaps some sort of problems with translation issues. Maybe the product of the speed, the haste with which this readout was published. Now, a few further things. At the Munich Security Conference, there was a huge amount of talk, a lot of discussion about a Chinese peace plan for resolving the situation in Ukraine. And the Chinese media have now started to talk about the fact that the Chinese do have ideas and it might amount to a peace plan, but they've been very vague about this. Lavrov and the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zakharova, have come out on record and said that if there is a Chinese peace plan for the conflict in Ukraine, Wang Yi didn't bring it with him when he came to Moscow. So they don't know about any Chinese peace plan, but they did discuss, there have been discussions about the situation in Ukraine, and the Russians overall are pleased, are grateful with what they see as Chinese understanding of the problems with respect to Ukraine. And in fact, the Russian Foreign Ministry has published a brief press statement, not exactly a readout, about the discussions that took place between Wang Yi and Lavrov. And it says, it includes this paragraph: Wang Yi expressed the Chinese side's vision of the root causes of the Ukraine crisis, as well as China's approaches to a political settlement. Sergei Lavrov commended Beijing's constructive policy and reaffirmed the high level of proximity of our assessments of this agenda. Now, note that this Russian readout talks about the Chinese side's vision of the root causes of the Ukraine crisis. And this is where it becomes very interesting, because over the last 2 days, the Chinese have published 2 position papers. In fact, if you go to the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, there's been a whole series of Chinese position papers, each one following upon the other. And some of them are on really rather odd topics. One is on the situation with gun control in the United States. Another is on the situation with, the drugs crisis in the United States. I can't really see why the Chinese Foreign Ministry would be involving itself in these sort of topics, but in fact, the answer becomes fairly clear before long, because what the Chinese are now doing is that they are preparing a major assault, an intellectual assault on the whole direction of US foreign policy. And they've now published a gigantic document which has the title US Hegemony and Its Perils. And I'm not going to read the entire document, that would take far too long, but one can get a sense of its overall flavor from its opening paragraph, its opening section, its introduction. Since becoming the world's most powerful country after the 2 world wars and the Cold War, the United States has acted more boldly to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, pursue, maintain and abuse hegemony, advance subversion and infiltration, and willfully wage wars, bringing harm to the international community. The United States has developed a hegemonic playbook to stage color revolutions, instigate regional disputes, and even directly launch wars under the guise of promoting democracy, freedom, and human rights. Clinging to the Cold War mentality, the United States has ramped up bloc politics and stoked conflict and confrontation. It has overstretched the concept of national security, abused export controls, and forced unilateral sanctions upon others. It has taken a selective approach to international law and rules, utilizing or discarding them as it sees fit, and has sought to impose rules that serve its own interests in the name of upholding a rules-based international order. Those words, rules-based international order, being written within inverted commas. And then it says, this report, by presenting the relevant facts, seeks to expose the US abuse of hegemony in the political, military, economic, financial, technological, and cultural fields, and draws greater international attention to the perils of US practices to world peace and stability and the well-being of all peoples. And then we have a whole series of subsections. The first deals principally with the US seeking to promote color revolutions and putting economic pressure upon various countries and its willful disregard of international law and its creation of blocs. The second section deals with the US use of force, the fact that the US has used force more than almost any other country in recent years, and that it quotes Jimmy Carter as saying that it's the most warlike nation in history. By the way, at some point, I think in this section of this report, the report actually quotes Julian Assange as well, which is, I'm going to guess, something of a red rag to the bull in terms of the United States. It then discusses US economic policies and how these relate to the rest of the world, and you can get a flavor of its contents from the title: Economic Hegemony, Looting and Exploitation. And there's a lot here about the US's abuse of the reserve currency position of the dollar. And then there's technological hegemony, the way the United States tries to prevent technological development in other countries. And here, of course, China is specifically referenced, but a historical example is given in relation to Japan in the 1980s about how the United States tries to obstruct the technological development of other countries so that it can preserve its own technological supremacy. And then there is a long section on cultural hegemony, spreading false narratives, which, by the way, is not just about the media, the way in which the United States uses its media and its social media, but it also addresses US cultural exports such as films and such things. And all of this, supposedly, well, according to the Chinese, part of an American policy to maintain overall US strategic and global dominance. And the Chinese, simultaneously with that document, have provided their own manifesto on how foreign policy should be conducted. And it goes by the name the Global Security Initiative Concept Paper. And it talks about things like core concepts and principles, that these should be to stay committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, that countries should stay committed to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. And by that, this section goes out of its way to stress the importance of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, that countries should stay committed to abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, that they should, and of course this is a rejection of the rules-based international order, that they should stay committed to taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously. And this, of course, brings us very much to the origins of the Ukraine crisis, that they should seek to resolve differences and disputes peacefully through dialogue and cooperation, that they should maintain security in both traditional and non-traditional domains, and then that there should be priorities for cooperation, like passengers aboard the same ship. Countries need to work in solidarity to foster a community of shared security for humankind and to build a world that is free from fear and enjoys universal security. Well, again, I'm not going to read it. It's a long document. It sets out very much, if you like, a Chinese manifesto for the way forward. And again, I understand some people will treat it with skepticism and even cynicism, but there it is. It sets out a vision which, it must be said, is profoundly different from the exceptionalist vision that you see so much of in the United States today, and which emphasizes the right of every country to chart its own form of development, to develop its own economic system, its own political system, according to its own traditions and its own interests, and to have those interests respected and to have its sovereignty and security respected as well. And it is not difficult when looking at these two documents together to see that the Chinese believe, and this is the point which they are making, and they're making it to the Russians, and in Munich they made it to the Americans and the Europeans as well, that the reason the Chinese believe that there is a Ukraine crisis is because the United States pursues its hegemonic policies. It interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. One of the color revolutions the Chinese refer to is the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which they say was clearly sponsored by the United States. It interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. It ignores the security interests of other countries, specifically Russia, in Ukraine and in Europe. And it looks for violent solutions to those conflicts instead of diplomatic ones. And clearly, you take these two documents together, it's not difficult to see that the Chinese feel the root cause of the conflict in Ukraine, to go back to the Russian Foreign Ministry readout of the talks between Lavrov and Wang, that the root cause of the conflict in Ukraine is what the Chinese now call US hegemonic policies. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I think there's an awful lot in these two papers with which I would agree. And, I can understand that some people approach these statements coming from China with a certain degree of skepticism and even cynicism. But let's put that aside. I mean, the question, it seems to me, is that you can take cynicism too far sometimes. And doing that can also make you disagree with statements of policy, which simply because you don't like the person who's making them, rather than because you actually disagree with the statements of policy and position and analysis themselves. Certainly, when it comes to the US, the analysis of US foreign policy, I think that the Chinese have got it basically about right. I think that they're quite right that after the Cold War, the United States cast off all restraints, adopted in its entirety a neocon agenda, at least it has at the moment, and this is resulting in many of the problems and many of the practices that the Chinese discuss in that position paper. But let's put all that aside and let's focus instead on why the Chinese are doing all this now. And that's straightforward, I think. We are now, whether people want to admit to the fact or not, in a situation where China and the United States are now adversaries. We are once more in a situation where there are two great powers confronting each other. The Chinese say that they approach this with deep regret. They blame the United States for it, and they set out a charge sheet setting out how the United States has brought it about. The Chinese are saying, we don't have to be like this. There is another way. This is the way that we're setting out in our other position papers, saying how international relations should be conducted. But of course, they know perfectly well, as all the rest of the world does, that the United States is not going to change its approach to foreign policy anytime soon. So what the Chinese are doing is they're saying, look, this is the United States. We are now obviously in an adversarial position with them. But you, for the rest of the world, consider who is offering the more attractive way forward. The Americans, with their interference in your internal affairs, their abuse of the dollar system, their imposition of unilateral sanctions, their methods of economic pressure, their meddling in your internal politics, their disruption of your traditional cultures, their constant efforts to try to get you to take sides on every international question, and their willingness to use force against you? Or do you prefer us? We talk about cooperation. We talk about seeking peaceful solutions. We talk about respecting your internal affairs. We talk about moving forward together, all of us, passengers in the same ship together, seeking peace with each other, accepting and respecting the differences that do exist between each other. But we don't seek to do what the Americans are seeking to do, which is impose ourselves upon you. And I have to say, I think for most of the world, the Chinese message is going to be the more attractive one. And I also have to say that I think that in this, as in so much else, the United States still uses many of the tools and much of the mindset that perhaps was appropriate during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union posed a very different ideological challenge from the one that China does today, and aren't perhaps taking heed of the fact that the Chinese challenge is actually a very different one. So that this kind of kinetic activity, this attempt to cite President Biden's usage to divide the world into democracies and autocracies, it just doesn't carry traction in the way that the struggle against communism did once upon a time. Anyway, the other point to understand about these documents is that the Chinese not only understand that they are in an adversarial relationship with the United States, but they are clearly now refining their ideological and political positions, and they're pushing back. Whether we like it or not, we are in an essential Cold War. It might not be spoken about that in that kind of way. There might be a pretense that it hasn't yet arisen, but the reality is that we are in a Cold War between the Americans and their allies and the Chinese and theirs. And that is ultimately why Wang Yi is in Moscow, and why Wang Yi is coming as an advance party, if you like, preparing the ground for the visit that's shortly going to come to Moscow from Xi Jinping. Each side is preparing its positions, sizing up the other, staking its claims, putting together its position papers and ideological documents, and preparing for this conflict, which is now already, to a very great extent, on the way. That is the reality of the modern world. Multipolarity may eventually come, and probably will, but for the moment, we are once again in a situation where there are two great political systems. You could call them alliances, but of course the Chinese pretend that their system is not yet an alliance, though it has many of the features of one. But two great systems, once again, in competition with each other. And the conflict in Ukraine is ultimately, and in its true origin, a part of that. And the Chinese understand that, and in understanding the future outcome of the war in Ukraine and what future Chinese policy will be with respect to that war, one needs to understand that ultimately, given the stakes, the Chinese are going to be on the Russian side, or at least in sympathy with the Russians here. And there's been, I've noticed, yet another report in the Wall Street Journal about the Chinese considering supplying arms to Russia. They're denying doing so. But ultimately and eventually, if the US engages in an unconstrained escalation in Ukraine to the point where there's a direct confrontation between the US and Russia, it will find China there on Russia's side. Well, that is the conclusion of today's program. More from me soon. In the meantime, I look forward to you joining me again, and I remind you that we're on, all our videos can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And we are, of course, also, you can also support us by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon, and have a very good day until then.